Why is my mother's picture inside your safe? The little girl's voice cut through the room so softly that, for a second, no one reacted. Then Charles Whitmore looked up from the crystal tumbler in his hand and froze. The amber whiskey inside trembled against the glass. Across the office, the child stood in front of his open-wall safe holding a faded photograph between both hands. And behind him, his wife stopped breathing long enough for the silence to become visible. 3 hours earlier, Whitmore Manor had still sounded like money. Soft jazz drifting through the ballroom. Silverware touching china. Laughter from politicians, investors, and charity board members carrying through the marble halls beneath chandeliers the size of small cars. Outside, rain slid slowly down the windows overlooking the dark Connecticut shoreline. Inside, every surface glowed warm gold. Charles Whitmore moved through it all with the polished calm of a man who had spent 20 years teaching the world that nothing could touch him anymore. But sometime between the dessert course and the final speech, something small had gone wrong. It was almost invisible, a missing 3 minutes on the security feed outside the west hallway. One of the guards mentioned it quietly into his earpiece before lowering his voice when Charles looked over. "Probably just a camera reset, sir." Charles had nodded and moved on. Wealth trained people to ignore tiny disturbances because there were always employees paid to clean them up. Then near midnight, while guests collected coats downstairs and drivers lined the circular driveway with black SUVs, Charles returned to his private office to retrieve a set of documents for tomorrow's merger meeting. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood polish and expensive bourbon. His desk lamp still glowed over untouched contracts. And his wall safe was already open. Charles stopped in the doorway. At first he only saw the child's shoes. Small, wet from rain, soles worn thin at the edges. Then he saw the girl herself. A little black girl, maybe 10 years old, standing perfectly still beneath the portrait lights. Her hoodie sleeves were too long for her arms. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of her coat. She wasn't stealing anything. She was staring into the safe like someone looking at a grave that had accidentally been left open. "Hey," Charles said sharply. "Who are you?" The girl turned slowly. In her hands was an old photograph with bent corners. Charles felt something cold move through his chest before he even saw the image clearly. A younger version of himself stood outside St. Vincent Medical Center under pouring rain beside a woman in blue scrubs. Marion Brooks. The sight of her face after all these years hit him strangely hard, like hearing a song he had spent years trying not to remember. The little girl looked from the picture to him. Her eyes were steady, watchful in a way children's eyes should never have to be. "Why is my mother's picture inside your safe?" she asked quietly. Charles could not answer right away. Behind him, heels clicked once against the hardwood floor. Evelyn had entered the room. "Charles," she said. Then she saw the photograph. Every trace of color disappeared from her face before she recovered fast enough to hide it. "What is this?" she demanded. "Who let her in here?" But the girl barely looked at her. She kept watching Charles instead. "My mama said rich people only lock away 2 things," she whispered. "Money and secrets." Then she lowered the photograph slightly, and Charles finally saw what had been hidden beneath it the whole time. A yellowed hospital file stamped in red ink with 2 words that made his pulse stop cold. Confidential paternity. The words sat between them like something radioactive. Confidential paternity. Charles Whitmore stared at the faded red stamp while the rain tapped softly against the tall office windows behind him. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Evelyn stepped forward too quickly. "Give me that," she said sharply, reaching for the file. The little girl pulled it against her chest before Evelyn's fingers could touch it. Not violently, just fast enough to make the room feel wrong. Charles noticed that immediately. Children who grew up safe did not move like that. They did not protect paper like it could disappear forever. Evelyn's expression tightened for one brief second before smoothing itself again. "Charles," she said more carefully now, lowering her voice. "This is obviously some kind of misunderstanding." The girl looked at her without blinking. "Then why does my mama's name keep showing up in your house?" Evelyn opened her mouth, but Charles lifted one hand slightly. Not to defend the child. Not yet. just enough to stop the conversation from spinning too fast. He held out his hand slowly toward the file. "May I see it?" The girl hesitated. Charles noticed the hesitation too. She studied him the way adults studied contracts before signing them. Finally, she handed the folder over carefully, but she did not step back. Charles opened it. Inside were medical forms, old insurance records, and a yellow hospital wristband sealed inside clear plastic. Marion Brooks, St. Vincent Medical Center, October 14, 2012. Charles felt something stir unpleasantly in the back of his memory. Then, sirens. White hospital lights reflected on wet pavement. But the memory vanished before he could fully catch it. Evelyn folded her arms. "You see? Hospital paperwork. That's all this is." Charles did not answer immediately. Something small had already begun bothering him. The wristband listed Marianne as emergency contact. For him, he flipped to the next page. His own name appeared again beneath a billing approval signature. C. Whitmore, authorized overnight extension. He frowned slightly. "I don't remember signing these." "You probably signed hundreds of medical releases back then," Evelyn replied too smoothly. "You were recovering from the accident." The girl spoke quietly from across the room. "Mama said you almost died." Silence. Charles looked up slowly. "Your mother told you that?" The child nodded once. "She said rich people forget scary things because everybody cleans up after them." Evelyn let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Charles, this is ridiculous. Somebody has clearly filled her head with stories." But Charles was no longer fully listening. His attention had shifted to something tucked into the back of the file. A small white receipt from the hospital coffee shop. 2 coffees. Paid at 2:13 a.m. 1 black coffee. 1 vanilla latte. Charles stared at it longer than he should have. "You drank vanilla lattes back then?" the little girl said softly. His eyes lifted immediately. "How would you know that?" "Mama remembers strange things," she answered. "She remembers what people liked before they stopped being kind." Evelyn stepped closer again. "Enough." Her voice stayed calm, but Charles noticed her fingers twisting tightly against her sleeve. This child shouldn't even be in this room. Somewhere downstairs, a television turned on faintly in the staff kitchen. The low murmur of late-night news drifted briefly through the hallway before fading again beneath the rain. Charles closed the file slowly. "What's your name?" "Nia Brooks." "How did you get in here, Nia?" The west hallway door didn't lock all the way. Charles felt a cold sensation move through him again. Missing security footage. 3 lost minutes. He glanced toward the office monitor mounted beside the bookshelf. One of the camera windows still showed static from earlier. Evelyn noticed him looking. "Charles, this has gone far enough." But Nia was already reaching into the pocket of her damp hoodie again. "There's something else," she said quietly. She pulled out an old flip phone with scratches across the screen. "My mama kept this hidden in a cookie tin." Charles barely looked at the phone at first. Then the screen lit up from an incoming battery warning, and his stomach dropped. The wallpaper photo showed a younger Marion smiling into the camera beside a man whose face had been carefully cut out of the picture with scissors. Charles stared at the phone as though the missing face mattered more than the one still visible. Marianne's smile remained untouched in the picture, soft and tired beneath fluorescent hospital lighting. But the man beside her had been cut away so carefully that only the sleeve of a dark coat remained at the edge of the frame. Not torn. Removed on purpose. "Who cut the picture?" Charles asked quietly. Nia shrugged once. "Mama wouldn't tell me." Evelyn stepped closer immediately. "Charles, enough. This child is carrying around scraps from over 10 years ago and acting like they mean something." But Charles barely heard her. His eyes had dropped lower toward the timestamp burned into the corner of the wallpaper image. October 14, 2012. 2:17 a.m. The same night listed on the hospital bracelet. The same night as the coffee receipt. Something tightened slowly in his chest. Not memory exactly. More like the outline of one. He reached for the phone carefully. "May I?" Nia hesitated again before placing it into his hand. The plastic felt cheap and worn, the edges cracked from years of use. He pressed the side button. Nearly dead battery. No service. But there were still unread notifications frozen across the top of the screen from months earlier. 1 voicemail, 2 missed calls, and beneath them, a text message preview that had never been opened. Charles frowned slightly. The sender name read only M. Price. Malcolm Price. He looked up at once. Across the room, Malcolm had just entered through the office doorway carrying a tablet under one arm. The older man stopped almost imperceptibly when he saw the phone in Charles's hand. Too small a reaction for most people to notice. But Nia noticed. Charles noticed too. "Sir," Malcolm said smoothly. "Security is asking whether the child should be escorted off the property." Nia looked directly at him. "You know my mama." Malcolm's expression did not change. "I know many people." "No," Nia said softly. "You know her voice." The room went still again. Malcolm gave a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean." Nia pointed toward the old phone. "That voicemail." Charles glanced back down at the screen. "You listened to it?" he asked her. She nodded. "Only once." "What was it?" Nia lowered her eyes briefly. "A man telling my mama not to call here again." Charles felt something cold shift beneath his ribs. Malcolm adjusted his cuff calmly. "Mr. Whitmore, old devices often contain spam calls. Wrong numbers. Disconnected." He said her name. Nia interrupted quietly. "He said Marianne." Malcolm stopped talking. Only for a second. But the second was real. Rain rolled harder against the windows now, blurring the lights from the driveway outside. Somewhere, downstairs, dishes clinked softly as staff cleaned up after the gala. The ordinary sounds made the silence inside the office feel even heavier. Charles unlocked the phone again. "Can you play the voicemail?" Nia swallowed. "The battery's weak." "Just try." She took the phone carefully and pressed the message icon. Static crackled faintly through the tiny speaker. Then a man's voice came on low and distorted from age. "Marianne, listen carefully. Do not bring the child here again. It's better if Charles believes." The message cut off abruptly. Battery dead. The screen went black. Nobody moved. Charles lifted his eyes slowly toward Malcolm. The attorney's face remained composed, but one detail betrayed him. His tablet screen had gone dark from how tightly he was gripping it. Evelyn stepped in too quickly again. "This proves nothing," she said. "Anybody could fake." "That was his voice?" Nia said quietly. Malcolm finally looked at her directly. "You're mistaken." "No," Nia replied. "I remember voices better than faces." Charles took the dead phone from her hand. His thumb brushed across the cracked plastic near the charging port. And that was when he noticed something else. Taped carefully beneath the case with yellowing clear tape was a tiny silver key engraved with the logo of First National Trust Bank. The tiny silver key sat in Charles Whitmore's palm, while rainwater crawled down the office windows behind him in slow, crooked lines. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Evelyn recovered first. She always did. "This has gone far enough," she said calmly, though her voice had become thinner around the edges. "Charles, she's a child carrying random items from a sick woman who clearly became obsessed years ago." Nia stood very still near the edge of the Persian rug, her damp sneakers leaving faint marks against the deep red fabric. She looked painfully out of place beneath the carved oak shelves and framed oil paintings. Every object in the room looked expensive enough to belong behind museum glass. Every person except her looked like they understood the rules of places like this. Malcolm extended one hand politely toward Charles. "Sir, if I may." Charles did not. "Hand him the key." Malcolm's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Bank deposit keys are common," he continued in the patient tone professionals used when correcting children and unstable relatives. "This could belong to any storage box, any account, any institution. We shouldn't encourage delusions without verification." Nia's fingers curled tighter around the dead flip phone. "Then why did you tell my mama not to bring me here?" Malcolm looked at her almost sympathetically. "Sweetheart, you misunderstood the message. I remember voices, Nia repeated quietly. You already said that, Evelyn replied before Malcolm could answer. And memory can be unreliable, especially when adults fill children's heads with stories. Charles noticed something then. Neither of them had denied knowing Marianne. Not once. One of the security guards appeared at the doorway. Tall, broad shoulders, earpiece still glowing blue beneath the hall light. Mr. Whitmore? He said carefully. The remaining guests are asking whether they should continue waiting downstairs. Charles barely looked away from the key. No. Send them home. Evelyn turned immediately. Charles, this isn't the time to entertain this. Entertain what? He asked quietly. The room cooled several degrees. Evelyn folded her arms. A stranger appears inside your private office carrying old paperwork, and suddenly everyone's acting like we uncovered a conspiracy. Nia lowered her eyes briefly toward the floor. I didn't come for a conspiracy. Evelyn gave a restrained smile. Then why did you come? Nia looked back up. Because my mama's getting weaker. The words landed differently than the others had. Smaller. Realer. Even the security guard shifted slightly near the door. Charles finally noticed how thin the child actually looked beneath the oversized hoodie. The frayed cuff around one sleeve. The way she kept favoring her left foot like the shoe hurt when she stood too long. Evelyn walked toward a side table where crystal water glasses rested untouched from earlier meetings. Her movements were graceful, controlled. Charles, she said gently now. This girl needs help clearly. We can arrange proper assistance. A hotel. Tonight. Medical referrals for her mother. Money if necessary. She glanced toward Nia without warmth. But none of that requires dragging your family through old fantasies. Nia's grip tightened around the phone. My mama never asked for money. People don't always ask directly, Evelyn replied softly. Sometimes they send reminders instead. Charles heard it this time. The contempt underneath the politeness. Nia heard it too. But the little girl did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She only stepped closer to Charles and carefully placed the hospital file back onto his desk. You can keep the papers, she said quietly. I only came for one thing. Charles looked at her. What thing? The truth my mama said got locked away in this house. The office fell silent again. Somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock in the east hallway chimed once after midnight. Malcolm checked his watch immediately afterward. Too quickly. Charles noticed that too. Sir, Malcolm said smoothly. It's late. Perhaps the child should rest while I contact First National Trust in the morning about the key. Nia's eyes lifted sharply. I never said the bank name. Malcolm stopped. Only for a second. But in that second, every drop of rain against the windows suddenly sounded louder. Charles slowly turned toward him. And for the first time that night, Malcolm Price looked like a man who realized he had answered a question nobody had asked. Malcolm Price recovered fast. Too fast. First National Trust handles most of the Whitmore family accounts, he said evenly, smoothing his tie as though the mistake had never happened. An educated guess, nothing more. But Charles Whitmore kept looking at him. Not angrily, not accusingly, just too long. The kind of silence that made polished people uncomfortable. Then Charles closed his hand slowly around the tiny silver key. Everybody out, he said quietly. Evelyn blinked. Charles. Except the girl. The words landed softly, but the entire room shifted around them. The security guard hesitated before stepping back from the doorway. Malcolm gave one controlled nod and moved toward the hall, though Charles noticed the older man glance once. Toward the dead flip phone before leaving. Evelyn lingered the longest. You're tired, she said gently. This is exactly how confusion starts. Charles did not answer. Finally, she touched his arm lightly before following the others out. The office doors closed. Silence returned with the rain. For the first time that night, the mansion sounded old instead of luxurious. Pipes humming faintly in the walls. Wind brushing tree branches against the far windows. Somewhere downstairs, a dishwasher started running in the staff kitchen. Nia stood near the desk without sitting. Charles noticed that too. Children who trusted adults usually sat down when invited into warm rooms. "How long has your mother had that phone?" he asked. "Since before I was born." "And the key?" Nia shook her head. She never knew it was taped there. Charles looked down at the object in his palm again. First National Trust Bank. Private Deposit Division. He remembered the key now. Not clearly. More like flashes underwater. Rain on a windshield. Marion laughing softly in a hospital vending machine hallway. His own voice saying, "If anything ever happens, keep this safe." His chest tightened unexpectedly. "My mama said rich people hide things in places that look official," Nia said quietly. "Because nobody questions official things." Charles looked toward her again. "Why bring this to me now?" Nia lowered her eyes briefly. "Because she got sicker." The answer was simple enough to hurt. Charles walked slowly toward the wall safe again. The open metal door still reflected the dim office lights. He crouched and checked the lower compartment himself this time. Empty, but not completely. Wedged deep in the back corner sat something thin and black beneath the shelf lining. Charles reached in carefully and pulled it out. A mini DV tape. Dusty. Unlabeled except for 2 words written in silver marker. Hospital Night. Nia stared at it immediately. That's the name Mama used. Charles felt cold spread slowly through his arms. "What do you mean?" "When she had nightmares." His thumb brushed across the cassette window. Inside, the old magnetic tape remained perfectly intact. "She'd wake up crying sometimes." Nia continued softly. "She always said the hospital night changed everything." Charles swallowed hard. He walked toward the desk where an old media adapter sat inside one of the lower drawers from years ago. His hands moved slower now. Careful. Like a man afraid memory itself might cut him open. "Did your mother ever tell you what happened that night?" Nia shook her head. "Only that somebody lied after it." The tape clicked softly into the adapter. Static filled the monitor first. Grainy black and white hospital footage flickered across the screen. Hallway cameras. Timestamp. October 14th, 2012. 1:48 a.m. Charles leaned closer unconsciously. Nurses rushed past the frame. Rain streaked across the emergency entrance outside. Then the footage skipped suddenly. Static. Missing signal. When the image returned, the timestamp had jumped ahead exactly 7 minutes. Charles froze. 7 missing minutes. The exact same gap security mentioned earlier tonight in the West hallway cameras. Nia looked at the screen, then at him. "That's not random, is it?" Charles didn't answer. He was staring at the lower right corner of the recovered footage where someone had entered frame just before the camera resumed recording. A man in a dark overcoat. Tall. Silver tie clip catching the hospital lights. Malcolm Price. And he was carrying a folder stamped confidential. Charles Whitmore watched the frozen hospital frame for a long time after the tape stopped moving. Malcolm Price stood near the emergency entrance in the grainy footage, holding the confidential folder tight against his chest while rain hammered the hospital awning above him. 7 missing minutes. 7 erased minutes. The screen reflected faintly in Charles's eyes, but his expression gave almost nothing away now. That frightened Nia more than anger would have. Slowly, Charles ejected the tape. "Don't tell anyone about this," he said quietly. Nia frowned slightly. "Not even your wife?" He looked at her for a second too long before answering. "Especially not my wife." The mansion had grown almost silent by then. Most of the lights downstairs were off except for the kitchen near the back hall where a small television murmured softly to itself while staff cleaned the last trays from the gala. Rain continued ticking against the windows in uneven waves. Charles picked up his phone and stepped toward the far side of the office. He dialed from memory. "Ethan," he said after a moment, "I need you to pull archived hospital footage from St. Vincent Medical Center. October 14th, 2012. A pause. "No, not through company channels. Personally." Another pause. "And Ethan? Don't involve Malcolm." Nia stood quietly near the bookshelf while he spoke. Her hands remained wrapped around the dead flip phone like it was the only stable thing she owned. When Charles hung up, she noticed he did not sit back behind the desk anymore. He stayed standing instead, looking out toward the dark lawn beyond the glass. "Do rich people always whisper when they're scared?" she asked softly. Charles almost smiled at that. "Almost. We usually call it discretion. Mama calls it hiding." He looked down at the tiny silver bank key again. "Your mother kept all this for 10 years? Nia nodded. "She almost threw it away once." "Why didn't she?" Nia hesitated before answering. "Because every time she tried, she got quiet afterward." Charles felt that answer settle somewhere uncomfortable inside him. He walked toward the safe again and entered a second code deeper inside the lower compartment. A smaller hidden drawer unlocked with a metallic click. Nia noticed his shoulders stiffen immediately. Inside the compartment sat several old employee records tied with black ribbon. Charles pulled them out carefully. Marion Brooks's personnel file was thinner than it should have been. Missing pages. Missing evaluations. Missing exit documentation. He flipped through silently until he stopped on a payroll correction form. His eyes narrowed. "That's strange." Nia stepped closer but did not touch the papers. "What?" Charles held up the form. "According to this, your mother resigned 2 days before the hospital incident." "She didn't." "How do you know?" "Because she still had her work badge after." Charles looked at her. Nia pointed toward the old phone. "I used to play with it when I was little." The badge was inside the same cookie tin. Charles's gaze sharpened slightly. "You still have it?" Nia nodded once and reached into her backpack. She pulled out a plastic hospital ID badge with faded edges and handed it to him carefully. "Marion Brooks. Employee access active through November 2012. Charles stared at the expiration date. 1 full month after the official resignation. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. Somebody had altered the records afterward. Downstairs, a spoon clinked softly against a ceramic mug in the distant kitchen. The ordinary sound made the silence upstairs feel colder. Charles placed the badge beside the payroll form and photographed both with his phone. Then he paused again. "Nia," he said quietly, "if your mother believed someone lied about that night, why come here now after all these years?" Nia lowered her eyes toward the carpet. "Because she started forgetting things." Charles frowned. "Forgetting?" "Some days she remembers every detail." Nia swallowed hard. "Some days she calls me by her sister's name." The room seemed to tighten around that sentence. Charles looked toward the rain-dark windows again. Memory loss, hospital trauma, missing records, hidden footage. Nothing fit cleanly anymore. Then his phone vibrated once in his hand. A text from Ethan Cole. Archive request blocked. Access overridden 10 years ago by Family Legal Counsel. Authorization code, M. Price. Charles read the message twice without moving. And for the first time in over a decade, he realized the man he had trusted to protect his family might have been protecting it from the truth instead. Charles Whitmore did not sleep. By 4 in the morning, the rain had weakened into a soft hiss against the mansion windows, and the house carried that strange hollow silence rich homes had after parties ended. Half-empty wine glasses still sat abandoned downstairs beside folded linen napkins. A lamp glowed dimly in the back kitchen where one of the overnight staff watched late-night television with the volume barely audible. Upstairs, Charles sat alone in his office with Marianne's hospital badge, the tiny silver key, and the old DV tape spread across the desk like evidence from someone else's life. Nia sat curled quietly in one of the leather chairs nearby, not asleep either. The dead flip phone rested in her lap. Charles looked toward her suddenly. "You said your mother remembered voices." Nia nodded. "Better than faces." He leaned back slowly. "Then maybe we don't need memory. Maybe we need repetition." An hour later, sunrise had not fully broken yet when Malcolm Price returned to Whitmore Manor. The attorney entered the office carrying his usual black portfolio, calm and polished as ever. But he stopped for the smallest fraction of a second when he saw Nia still there beside Charles. Charles noticed that too. "You wanted to see me early?" Malcolm asked smoothly. Charles poured coffee into 3 cups without answering immediately. Steam rose softly between them. 1 cup remained untouched near the edge of the desk. "Sit down," Charles said quietly. Malcolm obeyed. Nia watched him carefully over the rim of the oversized chair. Charles slid a document across the desk. I've been reviewing old personnel files. Malcolm barely glanced at it. And you said Marion Brooks resigned before the hospital incident. According to company records, yes. Charles nodded once. Calm. Controlled. That's what troubles me. Malcolm folded his hands neatly. Troubles you how? Charles lifted Marianne's employee badge from the desk and placed it beside the resignation paperwork. Because her access remained active for another month. Malcolm did not touch either item. Administrative delays happen. Do they? Charles asked softly. Silence. Somewhere in the wall behind them, old pipes clicked as the heating system turned on for morning. Nia kept watching Malcolm instead of Charles. The attorney remained composed, but his right thumb had started tapping lightly against his knee beneath the desk. Tiny. Fast. Charles saw it. Nia saw it too. Then Charles reached for the old flip phone. Nia, he said gently, play the voicemail again. Malcolm's eyes shifted instantly toward the phone before he could stop himself. That was all Charles needed. Nia pressed the battery into place carefully this time. The phone flickered weakly to life while everyone waited through. The long frozen loading screen. The tiny speaker crackled again. Static first. Then the voice. Marianne, listen carefully. Do not bring the child here again. It's better if Charles believes. The message cut off in the exact same place. Charles looked calmly at Malcolm. Interesting thing about old recordings, he said quietly. You hear details differently the second time. Malcolm gave a restrained smile. I still fail to see how this proves anything. Nia spoke softly without looking away from him. You changed one word. Malcolm blinked once. Excuse me? Last night, Nia said. You said maybe the message was spam. Her voice stayed small, but every word landed clean. But you already knew it was a voicemail before anybody said the word voicemail. The room went silent. Malcolm's thumb stopped tapping. Charles did not move at all now. That calmness had become worse than anger. Much worse. Malcolm gave a short breath through his nose. You're letting a frightened child create patterns where none exist. Maybe, Charles replied evenly. So let's test something simple. He slid the silver bank key slowly across the desk between them. Tell me which safety deposit box this belongs to. Malcolm's eyes dropped to the key automatically, just for 1 second too long. Then he answered carefully. I couldn't possibly know that. Charles nodded once. That's interesting. Malcolm looked back up. Why? Charles's voice remained almost gentle. Because First National Trust confirmed this morning that the box tied to that key was permanently sealed 10 years ago under instructions from Family Legal Counsel. The office became so quiet that the faint blinking sound from the security camera light near the bookshelf suddenly felt loud. Malcolm looked toward the camera instinctively, and in that exact moment he realized two things at once. Charles had already started recording everything. And the little black girl sitting quietly beside the desk was no longer alone in that room. Malcolm Price did not answer immediately. The blinking camera light near the bookshelf reflected faintly in his glasses, while the silence stretched tight across the office. Charles Whitmore remained seated behind the desk with one hand resting loosely beside the silver bank key. Calm. Too calm. Nia noticed something then. Malcolm had stopped looking at Charles entirely. He kept watching the old flip phone instead, like he was trying to calculate whether something worse still existed inside it. Nia spoke quietly. There's one more thing. Both men looked at her. She slid carefully off the leather chair and unzipped the smallest pocket of her backpack. Mama told me never to bring this unless somebody finally started listening. From inside, she removed a plain white envelope folded soft at the corners from years of being hidden. Not sealed. Not labeled, just old. Charles felt his chest tighten before she even handed it over. Malcolm stood abruptly. Charles, I strongly advise against continuing this conversation without formal legal representation. Charles did not look away from the envelope. Sit down, Malcolm. The attorney remained standing for one dangerous second longer. then slowly sat back down. Nia placed the envelope carefully onto the desk. Mama said he'd recognize the handwriting. Charles opened it with slower hands than usual. Inside was a single photograph and a small flash drive taped to the back. The photograph stole the air from the room first. Charles stared at it without breathing. Hospital room. October 2012. He was unconscious in the bed, bruised and pale beneath fluorescent light. Marian sat beside him wearing blue scrubs. One hand rested protectively over her stomach. Pregnant. Very visibly pregnant. Charles's fingers trembled slightly against the edge of the photo. He looked up at Nia slowly. How old are you? 10. He did the math instantly. His face lost color. Malcolm leaned forward sharply. That photograph proves nothing. But his voice had changed now. Not polished anymore. Tight. Charles noticed that too. Nia pointed toward the flash drive. There's audio. Nobody moved for a second. Then Charles inserted the drive into his computer himself. A single file appeared. Recovered_backup_2012. The recording began with static. Rain somewhere in the background. Hospital monitors beeping softly. Then voices. Marianne. First. Crying quietly. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking you to tell him the truth. Malcolm's younger voice answered immediately. Crisp. Controlled. The Whitmore family has decided discretion is best for everyone involved. Charles froze completely. Evelyn's voice entered next. Younger too. Calm and cold. If Charles wakes up believing this child is his entire inheritance structure changes. Charles's eyes lifted slowly toward the office door like he had forgotten the rest of the mansion existed. The recording continued. Marianne's breathing shook audibly now. He deserves to know.
No, Malcolm replied.
He deserves stability. Then came the sentence that broke something inside the room. Sign the separation agreement, Evelyn said quietly, or the child disappears from Whitmore protection permanently. Charles stopped breathing for a second. Literally stopped. The color drained from his face while the rain tapped softly against the windows behind him. Nia watched him carefully, almost nervously now. Not because she feared him, because she realized this was hurting him for real. The recording continued beneath the silence. Papers sliding across a table. Marian crying harder. Malcolm again. Charles will never see this recording. We'll make certain of that. The audio ended. Nobody spoke. Charles stared at the dark monitor long after the file finished playing. Then very slowly, he reached for the hospital photograph again. His thumb brushed across Marianne's face once before stopping over the curve of her pregnant stomach. 10 years. 10 years believing Marianne vanished without explanation. 10 years trusting the people who sat beside him at holidays, board meetings, charity dinners, hospital wings carrying his family name. And all that time the truth had been hidden inside his own legal counsel. Inside his own home. Nia's small voice finally broke the silence. She waited for you anyway. Charles closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something inside him had changed completely. Not louder, colder. He removed the flash drive from the computer, placed it carefully beside the silver key and the hospital badge, then picked up his phone. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet enough to make the room feel dangerous. Call my attorney. By noon the next day, Whitmore Holdings no longer felt untouchable. The boardroom on the 42nd floor overlooked Manhattan through walls of cold gray glass. But nobody admired the view. Attorneys whispered behind tablets. Board members avoided eye contact. The atmosphere had the careful stillness of people realizing power had shifted while they were sleeping. Charles Whitmore sat at the head of the table with Marianne's hospital photograph beside his hand. Not hidden anymore. Visible to everyone. Malcolm Price sat halfway down the table with two separate legal teams beside him now. Evelyn remained perfectly dressed in cream silk and diamonds, but her hands stayed locked too tightly together. Nia sat quietly near the far end of the room beside Charles's private attorney, her feet barely touching the floor beneath the oversized leather chair. Some of the executives kept glancing toward her with confusion, as though they still could not understand how a little black girl in worn sneakers had become the center of the most dangerous meeting in the company's history. Charles spoke only once at first. "Play it." The recovered hospital recording filled the room again. Nobody interrupted this time. Not even Malcolm. When the audio ended, the silence afterward felt heavier than the recording itself. Charles folded his hands slowly. "Effective immediately," he said quietly. "Malcolm Price is suspended from all legal authority tied to Whitmore Holdings, the Whitmore Foundation, and every family trust under my name." Malcolm finally lost composure. "Charles, you are making a catastrophic mistake based on manipulated evidence from a woman who disappeared for 10 years.
No, Charles replied calmly.
I made the catastrophic mistake 10 years ago when I trusted you more than the people you were hurting." Nobody moved. One board member removed his glasses slowly and looked down at the table. Another closed his folder entirely. The tide had turned too visibly now. Evelyn leaned forward carefully. "Charles, think about what public exposure will do to this family." He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You already exposed this family. You just hid it better." Her face tightened. Across the room, Nia lowered her eyes toward the old flip phone resting in her lap. She still carried it everywhere. Charles noticed that too. By late afternoon, legal notices had already been filed. Malcolm's access to all trust accounts was frozen pending investigation. Internal auditors reopened sealed medical foundation records from 2012. The Whitmore Foundation Board voted unanimously to restore Marion Brooks's employee history and benefits after discovering falsified resignation documents. But the real moment came quietly that evening in a small apartment 3 boroughs away. Rainwater still stained the edges of the old living room windows. The radiator clicked unevenly. A soup pot simmered softly on the stove. Marion sat wrapped in a blanket at the kitchen table, while a caseworker explained her restored medical insurance coverage and ongoing treatment plan. Not charity. Not hush money. Protection. Legitimate legal protection with her name properly attached to it again. Nia stood near the counter watching silently while Charles remained awkwardly near the doorway holding a brown paper grocery bag that looked strangely ordinary in his expensive hands. He set it gently onto the kitchen table. Milk, bread, fresh fruit, simple things. Marion looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "She kept trying to tell me you'd never really known." Charles lowered his eyes briefly. "I should have looked harder." The apartment grew quiet except for the soft bubbling soup on the stove. Nia finally stepped closer and took the old hospital photograph from the table. Carefully, she slid it into a small frame beside the television where family pictures usually belonged. Not hidden in a vault. Not folded in secret. Just visible. Real. Charles watched her do it without speaking. Then Nia turned toward him holding the dead flip phone gently in both hands. "Mama says rich people forget things because they can pay people to carry the memories for them," she said softly. Charles felt something tighten painfully in his throat. Nia looked at him for another second before placing the old phone carefully into his hand. "So this time," she whispered, "you carry it." And in the quiet little apartment far from the marble halls and locked safes of Whitmore Manor, the truth finally sat in the open where nobody powerful could bury it again.